톰 라이트의 강의를 들어보면 이 시대를 분별하는 성경적 시각을 얻을 수 있습니다. 시대를 분별하지 못하면 그 시대에 휩쓸리기 마련입니다. 어떤 시대든 단순하지 않습니다. 그 2000년 9월 11일에 일어난 그 뉴욕 세계 무역센터에 비행기를 충돌시킨 자살 테러가 있었잖아요. 이슬람 근본주의자들에 의해서 일어난 사건이었는데 이슬람 근본주의자들은 갑자기 생겨나지 않았습니다. 전통적인 이슬람 종교도 테러와는 전혀 상관이 없는 종교죠. 수백 년 동안 주변과 평화롭게 지내던 자들이 어느 날 갑자기 극단적 테러리스트가 되었다면 역사적, 사회문화적 원인이 분명히 있는 겁니다. 그리고 9.11 테러가 그 이후 이 세상에 미친 영향도 크지요. 제가 좀 단적인 예를 들긴 했지만 요점은 뭐냐면 우리가 살고 있는 이 시대는 어떤 흐름이 있고 그 흐름에 우리 모두는 알게 모르게 영향을 받고 있다는 겁니다. 그런데 과연 교회에서 누가 그렇게 이 시대를 분석해 주었나요? 저는 그런 설교나 그런 교회에서의 강의를 들어본 적이 없습니다. 예수님은 지금 세상보다 어쩌면 더 혼란스러운 1세기의 유대세계의 한 복판에 말씀이 육신이 되셔서 오셨습니다. 그리고 과거 수천 년의 이스라엘 역사의 정점을 이루셨고요. 그 역사를 완성하시고 이스라엘 민족에게 주신 하나님의 언약을 전 세계의 모든 민족을 구원하시기 위해서 성취하셨습니다. 그런데 제가 방금 이야기했지만 이스라엘 역사의 정점이라니요. 이게 무슨 말인지 설명해 줘야 되지 않겠습니까? 이스라엘 민족에게 주신 언약이 뭔가? 하나님의 언약이 무엇인가? 그것도 마찬가지로 설명이 필요하지요. 이 질문은 왜 예수님께서 이스라엘 민족의 메시아로 오셨는가 하는 문제와 연결됩니다. 왜 이스라엘 메시아로 오셨을까요? 우리 민족의 메시아로 오시면 왜 안 되는 겁니까? 이유가 다 있죠. 18세기에 서양의 계몽주의 사상이 나타나서 마치 인간 사회는 영원히 진보할 것처럼 여기며 과학을 발전시켰습니다. 그 발전된 과학을 바탕으로 전 세계를 자기들의 식민지로 만들었지요. 그때 그들이 내건 슬로건이 뭐냐면 미개한 사회를 문명화시킨다는 것이었습니다. 그 뒤 300년이 지나 현재에 와서는 그 계몽주의 사상은 모더니즘은 포스트 모더니즘으로 변했고 그런 사상의 흐름과 더불어 두 번의 세계 대전이 있었습니다. 그 후 냉전 시대를 지나면서 온갖 곳에서 좌우 이념의 대결이 있었고요. 홀로코스트, 학살이 반복되었습니다. 그 와중에 과학은 엄청나게 발전해서 이제는 AI 인공지능 시대에 접어들었죠. 조그마한 스마트폰 하나만 있으면 전 세계 어느 나라를 가든지 언어가 다른 그곳에서 다른 사람들과 자유롭게 대화할 수 있는 시대가 되었습니다. 그런 시대에서 기독교는 무엇을 하고 있으며 사람들은 하나님을 어떻게 생각하는지, 이 세상에 참된 복된 소식인 복음은 어떻게 그 모든 사상과 철학을 복음 아래 무릎 꿇리는지, 그리고 성경은 교회와 성도들에게 이 시대에 무엇을 하라고 말하는가 들어본 적 있으세요? 어줍지 않은 심리학이나 어떻게 하면 성공할 수 있는가 하는 자기 개발서를 무슨 성경의 말씀인 양 떠들고 있는 것이 이 시대 아닙니까? 에베소서 2장 2절에는 이런 말씀이 있습니다. 그때 너희는 그 가운데서 행하여 이 세상 풍조를 따르고 공중의 권세 잡은 자를 따랐으니 곧 지금 불순종의 아들들 가운데서 역사하는 영이라. 이 세상 풍조를 따르는 것은 공중의 권세 잡은 자, 즉 악한 영을 따르는 겁니다. 골로새서 2장 8절에는 누가 철학과 헛된 속임수로 너희를 사로잡을까 주의하라. 이것은 사람의 전통과 세상의 초등학문을 따름이요 그리스도를 따름이 아니다라고 분명히 선언하고 있습니다. 이 세상 풍조와 이 세상 철학을 따르면 창조주 하나님이 창조하신 참된 인간의 그 인간성을 상실할 수밖에 없습니다. 인간성이 상실되어지면 온갖 비극이 인간들 사회와 인간들 문명 속에 일어나기 마련이죠. 우리는 종종 인간성 상실이라는 말을 많이 하는데 그것이 뭔지도 잘 모르면서 그 말을 쓰는 적이 너무나 많은 것 같습니다. 이 강의를 들으면 인간성 상실이 무엇인지 그 의미를 제대로 아실 수 있습니다. 성경적으로 말이죠. 저는 대학에서 철학을 전공했고 대학원에서는 신학을 전공했습니다. 그리고 20년이 넘는 세월을 설교를 했고 또 거의 평생 60평생 가까이 되는 세월을 설교를 들으면서 왔지만 이 정도로 고급진 철학 강의를 또는 신학 강의를 설교를 들어본 적이 없습니다. 1시간도 안 되는 시간에 톰라이트는 세상을 분석하고 인간을 분석하고 성경을 통해 그 해답을 줍니다. 어렵다는 생각이 들 수 있지만 참을성 있게 몇 번이고 들으신다면 나의 생각이 나의 사고가 더할 나위 없이 고양되는 것을 느끼실 수 있을 것입니다. 부디 이 강의를 들으시고 또 여러 번 들으시고 반복해서 들으시면서 성경이 우리에게 주신 것이 무엇인지를 깨달으시며 놀라고 또한 승리하시기를 간절히 바랍니다.
Thank you very much again for your welcome. Thank you all for being here. It's a great joy to be with you. And I want to say special thanks to all the people who have been working hard behind the scenes. I've become very much aware over the last 2 or 3 days of several of you who are doing different tasks in order to make all this happen. And I'm really grateful, as I know everyone here is. My title for this evening, and Dean Durr and I had about 6 or 8 emails to discuss exactly what this should be about. My title for this evening is Living in God's Moment, Becoming Truly Human in a Demanding World. That's a demanding title, actually. St. Paul, writing in the second letter to the Corinthians, declares strikingly, now is the acceptable time. Now is the day of salvation. Paul believed he was living in God's moment, and he wanted his hearers to wake up and realize the same thing. And that's the beginning of my title, Living in God's Moment, but the real challenge comes in that second half, becoming truly human in a demanding world. So those are the topics: time, God's moment; space, the demanding world; and being human. You can't get larger themes than that, I think. But to get the force of what it might mean to live in God's moment, we need to stand back and realize the extent to which we easily get swept up in everybody else's moments. We in the UK are bombarded with one particular fact. Somebody asked me a question about it on Monday night, that we live in the moment after the Brexit vote and the moment before whatever it is that's going to happen. We have no idea what that might mean or how to think or what to do. You in Hong Kong have your own after and before moments in an unknown and unknowable ultimate future. But looking more broadly in global culture, we live, as we all say, in the modern world, but also confusingly in the postmodern world, where many things that looked fixed and certain when I was growing up are now being questioned or simply deconstructed. And unless we keep our heads and our hearts and our minds and our bodies rightly focused as followers of Jesus Christ, it's easy to live in everybody else's moment rather than in God's moment. And those other moments can be very destructive of genuine human life. I will say more about those other confusing moments presently, but first, by way of introduction to this evening's topic, let me point out something about what Paul said and the similar things that Jesus said, which we often miss. When Paul insisted on that now is the acceptable time, now is the day of salvation, he was thinking in terms of the ancient biblical sense of time as retrieved by many Jews of his day. Jesus was thinking the same way when he came into Galilee and said, "The time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God is at hand." What does this now mean? What does it mean that the time is fulfilled? For many ancient Jews and on into contemporary Jewish life, history was and is divided into two, the present age and the age to come. The present age is seen as the time of sorrow and suffering, of darkness and death. The age to come is the new time when God will sort out everything and put everything right. And those Jews who thought like that reckoned that the present age would go on and on and on until the time when, quite suddenly, God would bring it to a halt and launch the new age. There is, however, an exception to this rule. Once a week, every Sabbath, the age to come would mysteriously arrive in the present time. So, remember, like the Israelites in the wilderness tasting the fruit from the promised land while they were still out there in the desert, so the Jewish people kept the Sabbaths and were tasting in advance, they believe, the joy and the rest that they hoped would come in the age to come, tasting it in advance. And part of the point of the gospel, as far as Jesus and Paul were both concerned, was that this age to come had now arrived in the present, in quite a new and unexpected way, through Jesus himself. So when Jesus announced that this was the time for God to become king, and when Paul went around the Mediterranean world telling people that Jesus was Lord and that God had raised him from the dead, they both meant that God's new age had arrived in some sense or other, a kind of ongoing Sabbath, overlapping confusingly with the ongoing present age. God had called time on the present age of suffering and death through the death of Jesus, and had launched in the middle of ongoing history his new age, the age to come, the new now moment in which new creation was underway, with human beings of every sort and every possible background now summoned to share in that new world and thereby themselves to become genuinely human, to discover indeed what a genuinely human existence might actually look like. And we, 2,000 years later, celebrating this cathedral's special anniversary of 170 years, we are living in God's moment in more ways than one. And like all Christian celebrations, this ought to refocus our minds and hearts and vocations, so that we refuse to be beaten down or perplexed in the face of all the demands that the world outside might be making. Now is the acceptable time. Now is the day of salvation. How can we then grasp this message afresh in our own time, our own place, in our own lives? Let me say a few words to begin with about the demanding world, which is constantly trying to tell us what time it is. Imagine what it'd be like if every building in the city had a clock on it and every clock was telling a different time. That's how confusing our life is now. Many churches and cathedrals like this one have clocks that strike the hours and the quarters, and that's not just for decoration or convenience. From early days, the church has claimed the right to tell the world what time it is, and the striking clock symbolizes that claim. You know the old joke that a business consultant is somebody who borrows your watch to tell you the time, and a lawyer is someone who borrows your watch to tell you the time and then keeps the watch in part payment for the fee. The job of a theologian is to tell you what the time is and suggest that you adjust your watch to suit. That's what Paul was doing in writing to the Corinthians. It's what we have to learn to do in our own day and time. The church ought never to be merely reactive. We have to read the signs of the times, as Jesus insisted, and discern wisely what needs to be said and done. But the times are in God's hands, not in the hands of the world's outward authorities, nor in the random grip of impersonal forces. And we who claim to know in Jesus himself, the Lord of time and space, must, in our liturgy and in our public proclamation of the gospel, constantly be striking the true clocks which tell the world the true time. That's what it means, I think, to live in God's moment, to refuse to live by other people's schedules. Now, there are no doubt hundreds of ways to describe our present demanding time and the schedules it tries to make us work on, but there are two in particular which we will all recognize and which pull and push us this way and that. The first is the major global political shift from a post-Cold War lull into a new time of confusion and danger. Cold War, as you know, lasted from the end of the Second World War until the late 1980s with the fall of the Berlin Wall. And though that was played out in a North Atlantic setting, my sense is that the rest of the world was very much affected by what was going on, or not going on, between Russia and America and their allies around the world. But after the Berlin Wall fell, some people rashly suggested that this was now the end of history, that there was nothing now left to happen, that liberal democracy would now make its way around the world without difficulty. I think we lacked at that point clear and well thought out Christian voices to point out that this was a mirage. But it was a mirage, as quickly became apparent. And the analysis of our own history in terms of East-West politics or in terms of communist and capitalist economics had always shrunk the truly human question to fit those questions. But the human question, particularly the question of what the modern world calls religion, had been left out of the equation. Well, as we all know, it made a horrible comeback on September the 11th, 2001. Militant Islamism, which, as you will know, is very different from classical Islam or indeed most modern expressions of Islam, militant Islamism was a sudden force which nobody had seen coming, but which has now shaped and is still shaping our world. It demands that we live in its moment, so that whether we're traveling by air with all the new security systems, or whether we're trying to figure out what's going on in the Middle East, we are dancing to a different tune, and we wonder where it's all going to end. And you in Southeast Asia have all kinds of challenges, traditional ones and new ones. And the old rules of the Cold War days don't, I think, give you much help as you wonder what it might mean to claim this moment as God's moment. Somebody asked me the other night what I thought of the standoff between new left-wing economists and new right-wing economists. And part of my answer, apart from the fact that I'm not an economist and I don't pretend to know about these things, is that the old left-right split, which is part of the legacy of the French Revolution, is an incredibly unhelpful way of dividing up any question these days. That's one of the reasons why contemporary American culture and politics is in such a mess. And that may look ahead to my second point. Because into this political muddle, which is trying to tell us what time it is, and we in the church have to keep our heads and think about God's time, into this muddle we have to insert the second problem, which we can loosely describe in terms of modernism and postmodernism. Those are slogans which mean different things to different people, but there is a large point which comes through clearly. By modernism, I mean broadly the philosophy and culture of the European Enlightenment, which believed that the world was turning a new corner in the 18th century, and that liberal civilization and its values would now become universal. Humankind had come of age, industrial and scientific and medical advances were solving the world's major problems, and democracy was replacing or at least modifying autocracy. Progress was in full swing, so that the world was becoming a better place all round. You see it in one 18th century thinker after another, on and on and on, and then flooding through the 19th and into the 20th century. And this myth has been so powerful that despite 2 world wars and the Holocaust and genocide also in Armenia and Cambodia, and now the rise of global terror, people keep on, I suspect they do in Hong Kong, they certainly do where I come from, now that we live in the modern world, meaning now that we're all on this upward slope of progress and that the world is getting better and better all the time, and that it's just important to be, as the phrase goes, on saying the right side of history. But that modernist dream has let us down badly. Those advances in science and technology and medicine do not at all mean that the world has advanced in terms of moral or social or spiritual or political wisdom. There are no signs that we have learned major new lessons about the meaning of being human, let alone of being human together. And with the prophets of suspicion who arose to challenge modernism, Karl Marx and Friedrich Nietzsche and Sigmund Freud, we now have postmodernity, postmodernism. That word originally named an eclectic architectural style, but it quickly spread to become a label for the counter-modernist movements of all the little stories that have been pushed under the surface by arrogant Enlightenment modernism. Postmodernism says a plague on your ideas of progress. That just means your empire gets bigger and bigger at the expense of everybody else. Postmodernism says, don't tell us that you have discovered objective truth. That's just fake news designed to boost your own popularity ratings. Postmodernism says, don't tell us you have discovered who you really are, because each one of us is just a muddled mess of floating signifiers, posturing and pretending. Power, truth, personal identity. At each of these key points, postmodernity has struck back in 1,000 novels and plays and poems and movies, and all the complex social and political movements that go with them. And in particular, the old modernist dream of solidarity, that we were all basically one big human family and that everyone just fitted into this picture. And we ought to make grand universal rules and enforce them. That has been challenged at the root by the claims of difference, that we are all so different that any attempt to impose uniformity is actually a form of violence. Sometimes it's just funny. I was thinking about these things the last 2 days, and I saw an advertisement outside a clothing store a few blocks away from here, which says, fit in, stand out. In other words, try to obey the 2 opposite imperatives of modernism and postmodernism simultaneously. Best of luck with that one. But much more darkly, violence of all sorts is near the heart of the postmodern vice list. The Me Too movement is a classic postmodern protest against a male-dominated modernism. Islamism is a postmodern protest against the post-Christian secular Western modernism. I just discovered yesterday that Bitcoin is a protest against the big modernist banking system. Social media form a network of postmodern protests in which everyone tries to affirm their individual identity, indeed to construct an individual identity, or perhaps several individual identities, to avoid becoming just another cog in the modernist machine, and so on. There is, of course, multiple confusion in all of this. In order to use the internet and social media, which are among the principal drivers of free-for-all postmodernity, you need the ultra-modern technology of the computer and the smartphone. Postmodernity is in that sense parasitic upon modernity. It's why some people call it late modernity. We still need the high modernism of scientific medical advances, although the comeback of traditional medicines is another sign of postmodernity as well. People sometimes say when I talk about these things, you're so anti-modernism, and my normal response is, listen, I do not want to be operated on by either a pre-modern or a post-modern dentist. Thank you very much. I want high modern technology when you're messing around with my teeth. But one of the reasons for confusion and even despair among young people today is that those social media enable you to create and sustain an image of yourself which you project electronically into the world, supposedly representing who you really are. But one of the things that postmodernity has done is to deconstruct the idea of identity itself, either so that I can just reinvent myself every day or every moment, or so that I just become a random, confused mass of signifiers, various impulses dashing to and fro within me. And that is near the heart of the challenge of becoming genuinely human in a demanding world. The world demands that we present ourselves in various ways. The world constantly tells us that if we just check another couple of websites, just make 2 or 3 more quick deals, we will become more fulfilled and more satisfied. But like a gambling addiction, that incessant demand can itself become utterly dehumanizing. We need to learn how to take the initiative to respond wisely. As people called to live in God's moment, we need to reclaim time itself, kingdom time, Sabbath time, God's time, Jesus' time. Before we home in on the key questions about becoming genuinely human, let me say a further word about the world itself, this large, confusing space where we live, which we share with billions of others in an increasingly contested and complicated fashion. For a long time now, modern Christians have been used to seeing the world as an essentially godless place, separated by a great gulf from God, with us Christians huddling in a corner away from all the noise and bustle. Even though Christians will affirm that God made the world, we have usually assumed something like the deist view of God. God may have made the world, but he's now a long way away. How then can we relate to God? And we've tried to solve that problem by various types of Platonism. Perhaps that we have souls that function as a hotline from us to this distant God, or that one day God will simply come and take us away from here to be in his sphere forever. So the question then of being human in a demanding world would become a matter of trying to preserve a human identity within an essentially hostile environment. But that's not how the Bible sees it. In the Bible, God claims this world as his own, and he desires to live in it with us. That idea is so unexpected in today's world and so novel to many, including many Christians, that we need to spell it out a bit. Our instant reaction might be, well, knowing this dangerous and demanding world as we do, surely that can't apply now. Perhaps God did want to live with humans at one point, but surely by now that's all changed. And the answer to that would be that in biblical times too, the world was pretty dangerous and demanding, but that didn't stop the Psalms and the prophets declaring that God the Creator really did want to come and live here in our midst. Isaiah and Habakkuk declare that the earth shall be full of the knowledge or the glory of God as the waters cover the sea. Numbers chapter 14 says the same thing. And my favorite of all, Psalm 72, declares that when God's appointed king does justice in the world, looking after the poor, bringing special help to the needy and the widow and the orphan, why then the whole earth will be full of his glory. Those scriptural passages continued to be read and prayed through many dark and difficult days for the Jewish people. And the New Testament declares that the time has arrived. The time, God's time, has arrived for them to be fulfilled. But why? What did they mean? Those promises that the knowledge and glory of God would flood the whole world were visible in advance in the temple in Jerusalem. The point of the temple was never to be a religious retreat center away from the rest of the world. No, the temple was designed to be the microcosmos, a little world, a small working model of the whole of creation, heaven and earth together, or rather of the new creation that God was going to set up one day. It was a bridgehead for God into the world, not a retreat away from it. So just as the Sabbath was the weekly sign in advance that there would come a time when God's rule of peace and justice would arrive, so the temple was the physical, local, spatial sign of what God wanted to do for all creation. And here's the point. Today's world can be so confusing and disturbing that it's easy for a Christian to want to escape, to embrace a private spirituality away from the challenges, perhaps to come into a great building like this in order to get away from it all. I totally understand that reaction. But ultimately that would be to shirk the real challenge, which is to be part of God's world-filling project, God's desire and design that the world be full of his glory. Indeed, one of the reasons why the world often appears so dangerous and threatening is that God's people have routinely forgotten what God's project is really all about, or the fact that the time is now. But you say, we know that the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70 and has never been rebuilt. Yes, indeed. Jesus said that would happen. But in the New Testament, Jesus' followers claimed that what had begun with the temple was now fulfilled in a startlingly new way. It was fulfilled in Jesus himself, and then was to be fulfilled by the work of Jesus' Spirit, the Holy Spirit, in the lives of his followers. Most of us today reading the New Testament find it hard to pick up those signals because we don't routinely think in the way that they did. But in the early days it would have been obvious. Think how John's Gospel begins with that great opening paragraph, which I bet you read at Christmas carol services like other places around the world do. In the beginning was the Word, and you know what the climax is. The Word became flesh and dwelt in our midst, and that word for dwelt is tabernacled. This is a new temple theme. Jesus is the place where heaven and earth come together. He is the living Word through whom all things were made. He came and pitched his tent among us, like the wilderness tabernacle in Exodus 40, full of the divine presence, glory, grace, and truth. And John is equally clear that when the Holy Spirit is then given to Jesus' followers, this happens so that they can be extensions of that temple project. Jesus' followers are to be the primary means by which God's purposes for the world will go ahead. You see what I mean? If you let the demanding world bully you so that you shrink away and try to retreat, you're missing the point. The world is God's world, and God's project in Jesus and by the Spirit is to be God's people for that world. So if the Sabbath was the moment every week when God's ultimate future arrived mysteriously in the present, and if Jesus was declaring that now this was happening on a permanent basis, not just one day a week, and if the temple was the place where heaven and earth came together so that God's glory would arrive at that spot, and if Jesus was the living human who embodied that and commissioned his followers to be the same by his Spirit, why then that demanding world ought to look very different. And the challenge of becoming genuinely human ought to look very different as well. Let's now explore these together. What might it be to see the world not as a demanding, threatening place, but as the place which God desires to flood with his glory? And what would that do to the challenge of living in God's new moment, of becoming truly human? I venture to suggest that one of the reasons the world appears so demanding is that we all know in our bones it is made for something more than it presently is. In some of my previous work, I have found it helpful to use the image of the empty chalice. In the church tradition here and in my church, we frequently use silver or even sometimes golden chalices for the communion wine. They are often things of great beauty in themselves. But of course, the reason that they're made beautiful is because of what they're going to be used for, or more precisely, what they are going to be filled with. And I've often suggested that the reason the world appears to be so full of beauty and power and yet still feels unsatisfying and often even threatening is because the world is designed to be filled with God's glory and knows in its bones that this is so. But when the world turns away from the God who made it, it doesn't know what to do about this desire for filling. And so it comes up with relentless demands, which we then find threatening. And I suspect that we often allow the world to encourage us, to lure us into thinking wrongly about our own projects and possibilities, because these are really displacement activities. We ourselves know that the world is made for something more, that it's like a vessel waiting to be filled with God's glory. The prophets said so again and again. But lacking that filling, we try to fill it with all kinds of other things, with more successful financial ventures or more innovative technology. And in the same way, we know in our bones that we humans are made for something more than we currently are. The pains and puzzles of life and the threat and reality of death itself frighten us and push us towards experiments with our humanness which are designed to fill a gap, to satisfy a longing, which is really the longing for the new creation itself. For, as St. Paul says, the fuller clothing of the resurrection body. So, like a demanding child shouting at its parents for some precious object, the world makes demands on us and tries to get us to live in various ways and to work at various projects which, as I think we all know, pull our genuine humanness out of shape. And that's when we are tempted to become too busy, dashing around frantically, pressing more buttons to try to resolve more and more problems, as though that'll make us more genuinely human. Faced with that, many people, including many Christians, might say the only thing to do is to quit, to try to escape, to give it all up. But there might be a different answer. If we look out on the world with the scriptural promises and possibilities in mind, it might look very different. The world we live in is where God wants to come and make his home. That's what we're told again and again in Scripture. And one of the ways in which God comes to dwell in his world is through the wise, genuine humanness of those in whom God's Spirit dwells. The world demands things of itself and of us humans because it's made for something more but doesn't know how to get it. And we know, or we ought to know, because the Bible is full of it, what it is that the world really needs, the ways in which those needs get distorted into fierce and often dangerous demands, and the ways in which we might start to meet the real needs rather than caving in to the unreal demands. And at this point, our understanding of the world and our grasping of a genuine humanness come together. And this is really the point of what I've been asked to talk about tonight. What might it look like for the world to be filled with God's glory? And what might we human beings have to do with that? Come back with me once again to the ancient biblical idea of the temple or the tabernacle. I said before that the wilderness tabernacle and then the Jerusalem temple were designed as small working models of creation, or rather small advanced working models of the new creation. And when the story of creation itself was told, when the book of Genesis was finally put together, creation itself is spoken of as a temple, a heaven and earth place. A single place of two dimensions, a place designed to be God's home as well as our home. Now, in any temple in the ancient world, there would be one object in the inner sanctum which would tell you who the God was who was supposed to live there. In other words, an image, a statue or small model of the divinity. Now, as you know, the Jews had no image in their temple, much to the surprise of pagan invaders who concluded that the Jews must be atheists. They didn't have a God in there. Not so. As in Genesis, the image at the heart of the cosmic temple, this heaven plus earth creation, the image is the living human pair themselves, male and female, We humans ought never to feel that we are struggling for space or purpose within the world. We ought never to let ourselves feel that the world is too demanding for us. We are designed as the key middle term in God's cosmic equation. We are image bearers, designed to show the world who the true God really is. We are glory bearers, designed to be the agents of that filling with glory for which the world is waiting, and in the absence of which the world becomes demanding, like that bratty child. The demanding and dangerous world we live in might make some decide they need to escape. Some styles of Christian spirituality are all about doing just that, but that is to abandon our human vocation. Becoming truly human means rediscovering, celebrating, and following the calling to be God's image bearers in his world, so that the world may be transformed. So what does it mean to be in the image of God? Theologians have puzzled about this for generations. But once we realize how Genesis 1 is meant to work, it shouldn't actually be that difficult. If God created this world as a combined heaven and earth reality, in other words, a temple, with an image of the Creator at its heart, then we know what this means. The image of a God in an ancient temple was a kind of two-way mirror. It was there to reflect the purposes and power of the God out into the world, and to channel the worship of those around back to the God. So when the true Creator puts into his world this image, which we know as the male plus female human pair, we humans are designed to reflect the wise stewardship, the generous love, the nurturing and creative power of the one true God into the world. And we are designed to reflect back to God the worship and praise and adoration which the creation rightly wants to offer. That two-way reflection is what Christian living is all about. And that's why, incidentally, a great building like this, whose anniversary we are celebrating, faces, as it were, both ways, designed to draw people from all around in to worship the true God and to send us out again into the world, whose incessant demands are really a distorted and clamoring request to be filled with God's glory. And the point of being image bearers, as one of my students said to me the other day, is that we're not only flat surface mirrors to reflect God to the world and the world to God, we are also to refract like a prism so that we ourselves are transformed in the process. We are to be transformed by the light of God himself, and as we are sent out into the world, like Jesus becoming flesh, we become more truly and appropriately human. That is the balance which often seems to elude Christians as we lurch from an escapist, otherworldly spirituality to a false kind of immersion in the world's business in which our particular Christian identity gets lost. All this leads me to reflect on two distortions of genuine humanness which have become increasingly popular in today's world. First, there is the temptation to various kinds of what in the trade we know as Gnosticism. The Gnostic movements of the 2nd and 3rd centuries were a movement of despair, really. They grew up after the failure of the Jewish revolt in AD 135, which resulted in massive disappointment for many Jewish people, and that coincided with many Christians starting to realize just how dangerous it was to call Jesus as Lord when Caesar on the throne in Rome thought he was the Lord. Those outward threats caused many, both Jews and Christians, to turn inward on themselves, claiming to have a special secret knowledge. That's what gnosis means. A knowledge about God and the world, but especially about themselves, about who they really were. They claimed that they had within themselves a secret spark of life, so that although the world outside was dark and threatening and demanding, they had an inner identity which linked them to a true God who was quite different from the world, who had ultimately nothing to do with the world and would rescue them from it. Now, that idea of being the true enlightened ones possessed of an inner identity marking them out, has reappeared in the modern world, precisely in the movement called Enlightenment, and in much contemporary spirituality and ethics. That's why the Western world assumed for the last 2 or 3 centuries that it was effortlessly superior to everyone else. That's a form of Gnosticism. We are the ones who really know. We have found the secret. At an individual level, though, this is what's going on every time people talk about discovering who I really am. And that provides the implicit energy behind all those postmodern claims about personal identity, about being true to my real self, and so on. And this, of course, finds a dangerously ideal vehicle in the social media where we can invent and maintain that personal identity, which, of course, is constantly in need of being liked. And the Christian critique of this, from the 2nd century fathers like Irenaeus through to today, has always focused on 2 things. First, the creation is good. This is God's world. It may look dark, it may sound threatening and demanding. We have to go on saying this is God's good creation. And that includes our physicality, our bodies, which will be reaffirmed in the resurrection, something which the Gnostic never wanted. But second, what's wrong with the world is not that my true self has been trapped in this nasty, demanding world or in this nasty, inconvenient body, but that I have been lured into idolatry and sin, from which the gospel of Jesus and the power of the Spirit can and will rescue me. Gnosticism is a pseudo-religion of revelation. Christianity is the true religion of redemption. The Gnostic doesn't want to be redeemed or rescued, just to have the secret identity acknowledged. And in our own demanding world, the temptation to modern forms of Gnosticism is ever present. That urgent pressure to have our secret identity liked is a distorted parody of the true desire to know the love of God as our Father and Jesus as our Redeemer. But the second temptation goes the opposite way, and these two kind of balance each other out. As technology leaps forward in ever more astonishing ways, so that things we never imagined 30 years ago are now taken for granted, the internet and all its works being the obvious example, many people are wondering if, in fact, the human project itself is just one staging post on the way to a new sort of existence entirely. Now that computers defeat chess champions and Go masters, and now that driverless cars are getting ready to take over our roads, do we really need humans at all? Is this frail, muddled human frame just a transitory phase on the way to something bigger and better? Well, I'm not sure in what sense such a new phase could be better. We have to be careful not to be seduced by the rank modernist language in which the only value is scientific advance or industrial productivity. Samuel Johnson in the 18th century said that the end of all human endeavor is to be happy at home. St. Paul in the 1st century said, if we have food and clothing, we should be content. But our demanding world has pushed and kicked us into thinking that we can't be happy unless we've filled that home with more and more complicated electronic toys. Or that contentment could only come if we have the latest new fancy recipes or the most daring postmodern fashions. And in the world of work and business, we are faced with the constant pressure for ever more achievement, in inverted commas, with the insistent implication that if you can't or don't want to work a bit harder, to stay in the office a bit longer, you aren't really being a proper human at all, so that ultimately you might wish that you were a computer rather than a human being. What does it mean to live in God's moment and to become genuinely human when faced with pressures like these? Once we recapture the biblical vision of the world as God's place, the empty chalice longing to be filled with God's joy and glory, and once we recapture the biblical vision in which God's new time has broken into this sad old world in Jesus and the Spirit, and once we are fired again by the biblical vocation to be image bearers, then we will be able to reject these distorted versions of the human project. We must first set our face against that Gnostic temptation, because the problem with us humans is not that our inner spark of identity has been covered up by outward things in the world, including our bodies, but that our hearts are deceitful above all things, as Jeremiah said. And that, as Jesus said, out of the heart proceed all kinds of wickedness, which defile us and which wreak havoc in God's world. We need redemption, not just revelation of our true identity. But when redemption happens through the gospel, we find our true identity indeed as children of God, as the Messiah's family, with the Spirit dwelling in us, individually and corporately, so that together we become the new temple, the small working model of that new creation, through which God's purposes and wisdom are unveiled before the watching world, and indeed, through whom those purposes and that wisdom become projects for us to take forward into the world. In particular, again, as Psalm 72 indicates, those purposes and that wisdom need to be focused on the crying needs of the world, the crying of the poor and prisoners, the wailing of the refugees and the hungry. I know that many people in this cathedral and other churches in this city are hearing those cries and are responding to God's call to reflect his loving image into the world where that is going on. The world is longing to be filled with the rescuing glory of God. And when true renewed humans go to work on those projects, then we discover that what the world is really demanding and really waiting for is for us humans to be genuinely human, to be image bearers, to reflect God's love and compassion into the world. Thus, instead of retreating from the demands of the outward world, including our own bodily existence, into an inner narcissism where we jealously affirm and cultivate our private, fragile identities, we are called to learn to translate the incoherent demands of the world into what St. Paul calls the groaning of all creation, longing for God's children to be restored as truly human beings in order to take up once more our God-given image-bearing responsibilities. And that's why Paul, at the climax of Romans 8, when he's been discussing all this, says that we are to be, quote, conformed to the image of the Son, so that he might be the firstborn among many siblings. And that's why in Colossians 3, he speaks of the new humanity, which is being renewed in knowledge according to the image of the Creator. These are worth pondering at length. We must therefore also set our faces against the idea that being human might itself just be a temporary phase, a transient moment in cosmic history where we are going to move on to a sort of transhumanism and become something else. If you reinvent humans, you are in fact reinventing God himself by the back door, implying that what's wrong with humans is not idolatry and sin, but merely our limited capacity, which would be so improved if only we could become supercomputers instead. Actually, I think what's going on at this point is a displacement from the Christian promise of resurrection, which is what I'm going to be speaking about tomorrow night. Because as with creation itself, where the world, like an empty chalice, is longing for something more and so becomes ever more shrill in its incoherent demands, so people know in their bones, as we say, that we humans are made for something more than we presently are. But the answer to that longing is not to stop being human and to change ourselves somehow into turbocharged machines, which themselves, of course, would rely on human ingenuity for their manufacture. The answer is the promise of God's new creation, the promise of a new, complete, ultimately genuine human existence in the resurrection, but anticipated in the present. Through the gospel and the Spirit, we are humans and we're meant to be humans. And as humans, we are meant to worship the God in whose image we're made and be transformed through that worship to be world transformers. We are not supposed to be answering the world's demands in their own terms, which are so often distorted and produce distortions in those who try to meet them as they stand. We are called to answer the real, often unspoken or inarticulate demands of a world that somehow knows deep down that it is designed to be flooded with the glory of God. So, what might it mean then to live in God's moment here and now? What might be involved in becoming truly human in a demanding world today and tomorrow and the next day? I think there's always a danger that Christians look back to a time when things seemed easier, not that they ever really were, but that hindsight and nostalgia blot out yesterday's difficulties. And as a result, the fresh things that happen in the outside world, whether it's political events like the fall of the Berlin Wall or terrorist atrocities or the other things that have shaped our world, or whether it's the new social imperatives of an angry political correctness on the one side or an alt-right backlash on the other, all these fresh imperatives take us by surprise, while at the same time the demands of our job or the money markets, or our family needs, or whatever, crowd in upon us and threaten to overwhelm us. And as Christians, we often find ourselves playing catch-up with all of this, responding in an unprepared fashion to unexpected challenges and threats. But actually, as the children of God, renewed by the gospel of Jesus, indwelt by the Spirit, we ought to be the ones taking the initiatives and setting the agendas. We ought to be the ones telling the world what time it is and suggesting that they adjust their watches. That might sound unrealistic, but it's what Jesus himself did. Now is the time. The time is fulfilled. It's what Paul said. Now is the acceptable time. It's what Jesus' first followers did as they went out into a hostile world and started doing the gospel on the street, looking after the poor and the widows, providing medicine and education, loving people into the kingdom. That doesn't have much to do with numbers or financial power. It has to do with image bearers reflecting the Creator's power and glory into the world. One good mirror that reflects the sun will produce much more light and heat than 1,000 little light bulbs trying to compete. One Christian congregation worshipping God the Creator and Redeemer and refracting his love and power into the world around, the world as here of business and commerce, or the wider world of politics or power or whatever, will do more to meet the real needs of the demanding world than 1,000 groups dashing around trying to invent more machines or develop new commercial strategies. And within such Christian congregations, the individuals who make them up will themselves find that there is a genuine humanness which comes clothed with humility and hope, infused with joy in the midst of grief, an odd mixture of asceticism and celebration which might remind them of Jesus himself. After all, in the passage with which I began, St. Paul describes what it meant to say, now is the acceptable time, now is the day of salvation. He had discovered the hard way what it meant to be genuinely human when faced with the demands not only of the world, but of a muddled church. He wrote, as God's servants, we have commended ourselves in every way. Listen to his description of a strange, genuine humanness. Through great endurance in afflictions, hardships, calamities, beatings, imprisonments, riots, labors, sleepless nights, hunger, by purity, knowledge, patience, kindness, holiness of spirit, genuine love, truthful speech, and the power of God, with the weapons of righteousness for the right and the left, in honor and dishonor, in ill repute and good repute. We are treated, he says, as impostors and yet are true, as unknown and yet well known, as dying, and see we are alive, as punished yet not killed, as sorrowful yet always rejoicing, as poor yet making many rich, as having nothing and yet possessing everything. Now that sounds daunting, of course, but when we read the Gospels we might think, that sounds a lot like Jesus. And perhaps the challenge to live in God's moment today and tomorrow and to become truly human within a demanding world amounts to no more and no less than this: to follow Jesus as a church and as individual Christians, to be, as Paul says, transformed by the renewing of our minds, to be renewed in knowledge according to the image of the Creator. Thus, in God's moment, it is time for God's people to lead the way in addressing and transforming God's world, and to discover in that process what it might mean to become genuinely human, reflecting God's love into the world and reflecting the world's worship back to the glory of God. Thank you very much.